Well, hello everyone. Welcome to New Kingdom Media. I'm River Devereaux, and this is Andrew Das. Is it Das or Daz? I didn't ask you before, actually.
It's Doss. Yeah, Andrew Doss.
Andrew Das, author of the new book Remarriage in Early Christianity. And Andrew, nice to see you. Thank you for coming on to have a conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk today about your book, Remarriage in Early Christianity, and also, of course, the wider subject in general of divorce and remarriage. In particular, we're going to be looking at why it is that you argue in this book that there is no justification in the New Testament given for remarriage while one's spouse is still alive. We'll be looking at the New Testament, and we'll also be, if we've got time, be looking at the early church fathers as well. And then if we have time after that, we'll be answering any questions that you viewers have for us. So if you've got a question about the subject of divorce and remarriage, make sure you put it in the live chat and we'll have a look at those after our interview. So Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into it. Who are you? What are you up to? What church do you belong to? That sort of thing.
Well, I serve as a Niebuhr Distinguished Chair and Professor of Religious Studies here at Elmhurst University in the Chicago area, if you're in the States. I'm the author or editor of over 10 books in biblical studies, mostly in the Apostle Paul. I've done an 800-page commentary on Galatians available from Concordia Publishing House, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Publishing House here in the States. I'd served years ago as a Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor, and so that's my church background.
Great. And so tell us just a little bit, why did you write this book, Remarriage in Early Christianity? Here it is here. Why did you write it? And so what sort of contribution are you hoping that this will make to the sort of academic world, but also to the life of the church?
Yeah, it was the late 1980s. I was serving as the editor for my seminary student theology journal, and a student had just finished his master's thesis and sent the journal a paper based on it. Well, it turns out that a new book had come out a few years earlier in 1984 titled Jesus and Divorce by Gordon Wenham and William Heth. They were Protestant evangelicals, and they'd taken the position that Jesus had strictly forbidden remarriage after divorce. Now, I had never heard that point of view before. My church tradition as a Lutheran has always held that remarriage is permitted for the innocent party of a divorce. Well, the author of this essay was struggling with why the original biblical text of Matthew 19:9 really does have an exception clause in it for divorce and remarriage. The earliest and the best Greek manuscripts disagree. And I mean, I agreed with him that a strong case can be made that the exception clause is there and that perhaps it's modifying both divorce and marriage. But I was troubled in his paper by how he had listed several of the earliest Christian authors prior to the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and every one of them had denied that remarriage after divorce is possible. And if that's so, it seemed then that our modern remarriage of innocent parties is actually at odds with the teaching of the first Christians, and that really bothered me. So I went out and bought a copy of Heth and Wenham's book, put it on the shelf, and figured I'd come back to it later on. But I just wanted to be sure for myself, as someone trained to be a pastor, that I wouldn't be leading people to commit adultery. I mean, the New Testament does have these strong statements against divorce and remarriage. In Mark 10:11-12, Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Also, she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Well, reading that then as a pastor, I wouldn't want to be complicit in adultery. And so the stakes seemed to me to be awfully high. Well, about 10 years later, the issue came up again. I was teaching an upper level course in the Synoptic Gospels at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And I discovered that historical Jesus specialists had concluded that we can be about as certain as is possible in the discipline that a critically reconstructed, quote, historical Jesus did not permit people to marry again after the divorce. So here I was finding that same question coming up again in the classroom. And about that time, two close friends of mine who were pastors were marrying recently divorced women. And in our conversations, I just couldn't find a way in the Bible to justify remarriage after divorce. So those conversations would eventually give rise to this book, especially as I was at that point entering into the ministry. I just wanted to make sure, especially if I were asked to marry people who've been divorced, about the propriety of it. And I mean, ultimately, if remarriage after divorce is adultery, then we as Christians certainly wouldn't want to be leading people into that by our teaching and our practice. So, whether you agree with me or not, I think we can all agree that the stakes are high in this question.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, for viewers watching, it's no surprise that I agree with you and the conclusions you come to in the book, although I think we differ a little bit on the pastoral application, but I don't think we'll be getting into that today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from my perspective, I was studying and training to be a minister as well, and I also thought I better sort this out because it has enormous implications. St. Paul says that, make no mistake, adulterers won't enter the kingdom of heaven, so you've got to kind of get this right. And I, for a while, just had that view that the innocent party can remarry if their spouse committed adultery. But what sort of started off this sort of deep questioning for me was it sort of started with me realizing the logical problems of that position, how it actually kind of ends up not making any sense for various reasons. Like, for instance, if you have an illegitimate divorce just for a silly reason, and then one of the parties remarries, wouldn't that remarriage be adultery? And then the other one can remarry. So then you're effectively saying that any divorce will ultimately lead to someone being allowed to remarry. And so is it a case of who remarries first as the guilty party? And it just, things like that. I started to think this doesn't seem to make sense. And then I was also very troubled by how the exception clause in Matthew 19:9, if it allows one to remarry, how is that not just a total contradiction of Mark 10's plain sense? And how is that not a contradiction of 1 Corinthians 7:39 and Romans 7? And so as I looked into it, then I realized the early church before Nicaea were unanimous on the issue. And so from there, I ended up, believing that, the permanence of marriage position and that remarriage is always adultery while your spouse still lives. And then, I heard about your book, read it, loved your book. I'd highly recommend it to all you viewers if you want to get into this issue. It's very scholarly and academic. And Jesus and Divorce by Wenham Heth is sort of the very famous evangelical work. And this book will sort of builds on that by looking at new arguments that have come to light since that book was written, over 40 years ago now, wasn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, so so I'd highly recommend it. Thank you for writing it. It was a good read. All right, well, let's get into it then. So in your book, you talk about the bill of divorce that existed in the time of the New Testament. What were these bills of divorce? What was in them? And what are the implications about the level of acceptance of divorce and remarriage in the ancient world for this discussion?
Yeah, we have a scholar by the name of David Instone Brewer. Years ago, he was active at the time I was working on this question, especially with these other pastors, and he collected every single divorce certificate he could find from the ancient world, and he placed them on a website for people to study. I benefited from it even now. And the certificates regularly say that the divorced wife is, quote, free. And that was the language that these documents would use. So the former wife is now free to marry someone else. So no future potential husband would need to worry that she's a taken woman or that he's violating another man's wife. So the Greeks and the Romans would give out these divorce certificates, but so also would the Jews. So the Jews around the year 200 created a document called the Mishnah. It recorded their interpretations of the Torah of Moses. And one of the tractates of the Mishnah is called Gittin, and it's named after the Jewish bill of divorce, their divorce certificates. So Jewish men, upon divorce, would give their wives these certificates, and it was supposed to read, "You are a freed woman. You belong to yourself. The wife is now free." And it's the same freedom that you see in the Greek and the Roman divorce certificates. So Josephus, this first century Jewish historian, talks about husbands would divorce their wives, and they were supposed to give them that divorce certificate. And we've actually come across first century Jewish divorce certificates that have survived, and they spell out how a woman is now free or permitted to marry another man. Even in Deuteronomy 24, verse 4, in the Torah itself, when a man divorces his wife, he's supposed to give her a certificate. In fact, these divorce certificates are actually kind of ancient. They go back well before the first century to the time of the Assyrians in 1400 BC and The later Babylonians, they too would regularly pronounce the wife, quote, free to marry, and that she may go wherever she wishes. So Jewish practice on divorce remarriage was the same as the Greeks and the Romans, as well as the ancient Assyrians and the Babylonians. But here's the key question in all this. Is the idea that Jesus would label remarriage adulterous so outlandish in the ancient world as to be ruled out as just wrong? David Instone Brewer and Craig Keener are both scholars who've argued just that, and they've been very persuasive to many other scholars. But here's where they're coming up short. There are indeed those among the Romans, the Greeks, and the Jews, albeit a small minority, who questioned the propriety of remarriage or viewed it negatively. And so for the Romans, you come across inscriptions dedicated to what are called univira, women who remain faithful to a single spouse in the course of their lifetimes. And you even have references in the literary sources of the period of these women. There are also references to men promising to be faithful to their single spouse for their lifetimes, and even some inscriptions honoring the men, although not as many as for the women. I mean, in the Greek world, you occasionally will come across inscriptions where a partner is celebrated or promises only to have a single spouse for a lifetime. Greek romance novels would narrate the surviving spouse often crying over the graveside. It was kind of a stock scene of the loved one and promising never to marry again. You have this also in the Jewish world. In the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Qumran community, you have a fragment of what is called the Damascus document, which gives permission for a male community member to marry an unmarried virgin or a widow who has not had sexual relations after the death of her husband. So the widow could remarry. But do you notice how the document never even considers as a possibility that the divorced could marry again? It wasn't even an option. And so that fragment places in perspective another passage in the Damascus document, one talking about not marrying two women in their lifetimes. And so this would be a reference not to polygamy, but to a second wife after the divorce of the first while the first wife still lived. This was a live issue for them. And then it puts in perspective a third document from the Dead Sea, what's called the Temple Scroll, where the future king is not to take another wife while the first remained alive. Where marriage was only permitted after a spouse's death and not after divorce. And all three of these Jewish texts from the Dead Sea. So we have this minority position in the ancient world celebrating lifelong marriage that renders Jesus' teaching more understandable. But on the whole, though, of course, the vast majority of the ancient world would assume the possibility of remarriage after divorce. In fact, Emperor Augustus even was pushing for remarriage in his marital legislation. So this is really against the grain in that society. But what Jesus is saying is not entirely unprecedented.
Yeah, thanks for that. So for viewers who aren't as versed in this sort of debate, your position, my position is that in Matthew 19:9, when Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife, except it be for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery against her. Our argument is that when Jesus says except for sexual immorality, that permits divorce, but doesn't permit remarriage. So divorce is adultery unless it's for the cause of sexual immorality, because in Matthew 5:32, he'd already said that divorcing your wife is adultery. But remarriage is always adultery. So the exception clause modifies the first part and not the second part. But David Instone Brewer, his argument is that it would be completely nonsensical for Jesus to say you can divorce but can't remarry, because divorce was understood to always entail remarriage, to basically just allow remarriage. And
Well, and
you
it's
bring
not
it up
just
in the book.
Instone Brewer. It's also,
Yeah, and Craig Keener as well. Yeah.
And RT France and commentators are regularly pointing to Instone Brewer on just this and saying the same, that it's just inconceivable in the ancient world for there to be a divorce not followed by a remarriage.
Yeah, that's right. And I some people I know who disagree with me on remarriage, this is the argument that they always use. So yeah, you've brought up the fact that one, is actually not unprecedented, although it is unprecedented to a very large degree.
Right.
But the other argument that you make in the book, though, is that okay, but what are we saying? Are we saying that Jesus' teaching, we're just going to sort of go against what he seems to clearly be saying because it disagrees with the culture? It's a bit of a strange argument, isn't it? Jesus is a pretty countercultural teacher. He's countercultural on almost everything. So why is it such a shock that he would be countercultural here as well? I definitely find it quite odd, I have to say. So, but yeah, thank you for going into that, and that's really a good contribution that your book makes, is looking at actually some of the evidence that goes against what David and Sabra and others are saying. Yeah, I have to say, just as we're talking about people, the sort of scholars who disagree with us, one thing I was sort of a little bit disturbed by while reading your book was to discover the lengths that some scholars will go to get around what we think is Jesus's teaching. With some of how they translate Matthew 5:32, some of them translate it in such a way that I thought was very bizarre to get around what he seems to be saying. And then you even reference scholars who try and say that the Shepherd of Hamas doesn't unequivocally forbid remarriage. Right. And when I read that, I was quite shocked. I thought, if there's going to be a scholar who's going to actually try and argue that the Shepherd of Hamas doesn't unequivocally prohibit remarriage, then why should we trust how they're gonna interpret the New Testament? Because it definitely does look like they're trying to sort of twist things in a certain direction. They've already made up their mind. They want to make the data reflect it. But anyway, so thank you for getting into that. We'll get to our next question. So before we turn to Matthew 19:9, which is kind of what this really hinges on, also 1 Corinthians 7:15 to a somewhat lesser degree. What does just tell us, what does Jesus say in Mark 10 and Luke 16 about divorce and remarriage?
Yeah, the reason I spend so much time on that widespread acceptance of divorce, remarriage, and antiquity, granted you have this minority tradition, so it's a little bit of what Tom Wright will talk about. You'll have double dissimilarity, but then you also have double similarity, which allows plausibility to this point of view. So it's not so outlandish. Nevertheless, it is largely countercultural, and that's important because given that widespread acceptance of divorce or remarriage, you have to keep that in mind. It's precisely what makes Jesus' teachings in the gospel stand out all the more. They're just that much more countercultural because he's taking a very different view than his larger society. He's going to talk about remarriage as adulterous, and that's just something rather unusual in this world. These are minority traditions we've talked about. So Jesus says in Mark 10:11-12, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Also, she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Again, it's very unexpected. It's against the grain of the surrounding world. But for Mark, this is emphatic teaching. It takes place privately with the disciples. It takes place inside a house. Both of those are ways that Mark will emphasize the teaching as important. He stresses those settings where the teaching is taking place. And even more, Mark places this teaching smack dab in the middle of a section of his gospel on discipleship. So discipleship, it's tough, it's demanding, but at the end of the day, as Jesus says, what's impossible for human beings is possible for God. God enables that challenging life of discipleship, including even adhering to Jesus' teaching, his difficult teaching about a divorce or a marriage. And notice that as Jesus is teaching, there's nothing here about divorce certificates. There's nothing here about innocent parties. It's just absolute teaching. So Mark's community, as they're listening to the gospel being read, they would have concluded that divorce and remarriage are adulterous. And for Mark and his community, that's how Jesus remembered his teaching. And they would have practiced accordingly. And it's much the same with Luke in Luke 16:18 for Luke's audience. Jesus teaches there, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. And everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. And just as in Mark, it turns out that this is emphatic teaching for Luke as well. And so Luke has Jesus saying in the verses just before, the law and the prophets were until John, and since then the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and everyone's urgently invited to enter it. but it's easier for one stroke of the letter of the law to drop out. So not one stroke of a letter of a law is a dropout. And then in the story, just after Jesus' divorce from marriage teaching, we have the rich man and Lazarus, which concludes with the rich man's being told if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they'll not be persuaded someone rises from the dead. So divorce and remarriage turn out to be at the heart of what it means to listen to the law and the prophets. And so when you look sideways in Luke's gospel, you're not surprised then that adultery turns out to be at the top of the list of the commandments in Luke's gospel. So in Luke chapter 18, verse 11, you will meet a Pharisee and a tax collector. And the Pharisee says, God, I thank you, I'm not like other people, like greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So one of the marks of law observance is to live a life free of adultery. And then just a little bit later in Luke 18, verse 19, you ask yourself, what's the first commandment Jesus mentions to the rich young man from the law of Moses? He says to him, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal. So adultery is the preeminent command in the second table of the law. So although the context of Luke 16 is primarily about keeping the law of Moses and how you use your possessions, Luke has this teaching on divorce, remarriage here, and it sticks out in its context. But that's precisely the point. It sticks out for emphasis. For Luke's audience and for his community, there is to be no divorcing or remarrying, since that's adultery. And it's unfitting for a disciple of Jesus Christ, and it's unfitting for the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So this is absolute teaching.
Yeah, it is absolute. There's no exceptions given. And that's why if Matthew 19:9 does allow for remarriage, that's quite odd, because that's quite an important thing to mention. Like, so Jesus says remarriage is adultery. Unless you divorce for adultery, then it's not. If that's what he's saying, you'd think that Luke and Mark would want to mention that, because that's a very, very important exception. Divorce for adultery, I mean, these days is certainly quite common. I think adultery is one of the main reasons people get divorces. So if it turns out you can actually remarry after divorce due to adultery, that would be a very important thing to note. And it's conspicuous that Mark and Luke don't mention it, which makes it seem like maybe that exception in Matthew is only relating to divorce and not remarriage, which makes even more sense when it's actually Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that explicitly says that divorce is also adultery, not just remarriage. Divorce is also adultery, which is why he'd want to also say, unless you divorce for adultery. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, well, let's move on to Matthew 19:9 then. So,
you want to skip Matthew 5?
Actually, no, we should get into Matthew 5:32. I was just looking over
comes
my
first.
notes, actually. It does come first. So Jesus is very old during his teaching, of course, on divorce and remarriage. Is very countercultural. But then in Matthew 5:31-32, there's this exception clause. It says, except for sexual morality, or except for porneia is the Greek word there. So first of all, what does porneia refer to? And does it mean that you can remarry if you divorce for it, or is it just relating to divorce?
Yeah, Jesus says in Matthew 5:32, but I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in cases of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Sexual immorality is the word you have in the exception clause there. As you mentioned, it's the Greek word porneia, from which we get our word pornography. But some people just aren't comfortable with Jesus permitting divorce here at all, and have argued that the Greek word is talking about something more specific than sex outside the marital relationship. And so one group thinks that Jesus is referring to illegitimate marriages, what are not really marriages in the first place. And you'll find that in Leviticus 18, it will talk about how you're not supposed to marry someone you're too closely related to. And so you remember that King Herod in Matthew chapter 14 had married the former wife of his brother. And so John the Baptist went after him a bit for it. The problem is that the first Greek-speaking Christian authors in those early centuries never understood this word as referring to incest. And then when you actually turn to Luke 18, at least in the Greek translation of it, it doesn't use the word porneia. I mean, had it used that word, it would have been a stronger connection. And for that matter, just incest just wasn't as strong enough a factor in the Roman world really for it to get airtime. I don't think it would have been a factor really for Matthew's Jewish audience. And if context is king, there's just nothing in this context that suggests that meaning for the word. And we're not talking then about marrying your close of kin. So another group thinks that this word refers to sexual sin during the betrothal period. It was a very popular view. It's sexual sin during betrothal, but not during the marriage itself after you've consummated it. And so again, you wouldn't have any permission to divorce in Matthew 5:31-32. This would all be about during the betrothal. It's a neat and tidy way to dovetail Matthew 5:32 with what you see in Mark and in Luke. And you recall that Joseph had wanted to divorce his betrothed wife in Matthew chapter 1 before he had the full details of what was going on there. But there are problems here too. Matthew never calls Mary's perceived sin an instance of suspected porneia. I mean, had he done that, that connection would have been firmer there as well. And again, the context of Matthew 5 doesn't give us anything that this is an issue. The context is a sin of the 10 commandments. We were just talking about murder, so wouldn't this be about adultery? And frankly, if the marriage were illicit, the couple wouldn't even have needed a divorce, since it wouldn't have really been a marriage in the first place. So we can rule these approaches out. We do have a genuine permission for divorce here. Now, the Greek word is used at the time of the New Testament more broadly for sexual relations outside of a proper marital context. That could be premarital sin or even adultery. It doesn't mean pornography. It means having sex with someone in the ancient world. So we have an exception here for sexual sin with someone else. But you might ask yourself then, well, then why didn't Jesus use the word for adultery, which is in Greek, it's a word called moikeia, as opposed to porneia. So you're getting a little Greek here along the way too. But why then use sexual sin porneia rather than we have a ready word for adultery? But there's an easy answer to this. Moikeia or adultery was normally used for men in the ancient world, since only men could adulterate by violating another man's property. The ancients at that point viewed the wife as a man's property. And so a woman didn't properly adulterate, only the man. So porneia became a word broad enough to include also women's sexual activity and initiative. And I mean, the distinction is not hard and fast, but the use of porneia reflects that broadening to see women as capable of adultery. Now, for a Jewish person, the possibility of women's having sinned sexually became the basis for divorce. One sees this in Matthew 1:19-25, when Joseph is faced with Mary's apparent sexual sin. They hadn't yet consummated their marriage. They were betrothed, which for Jews was the first step in marriage itself. But by choosing porneia instead of moikeia, which for this exception clause here, we're not just talking about those who've consummated the marriage, or moikeia proper, but we're using a word that can also be used for that period of betrothal. So both the consummated marriage and the betrothal period. So it's a word that encompasses both. And so the exception clause does helpfully show that Joseph was not sinning to divorce his betrothed wife.
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's very important here to note that because adultery was something that men would do, sexual immorality, porneia, that's saying that that's the wife's adultery. Right. So would you say then that this exception clause, so Matthew 5:32 says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. What is that exception clause doing? And then maybe even before we get there, what is if we just remove the exception clause for a minute, what's this actually saying? What does it mean? Whoever divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery. What does that mean? And then what does the exception clause do?
Right. So we still have a number of questions here in Matthew 5:32 to parse through. So Matthew in his gospel records Jesus making an exception to his strict prohibition of divorce. So Matthew 5:32, we read, "By say to that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So what can we conclude? Divorce is adulterous. Like all the other sins a man commits in this context, to divorce his wife is just as sinful. And even worse, not only is it sinful, but the husband is causing his wife to commit adultery. And that's an issue because in this patriarchal world, most divorced women would need to marry again to survive. I mean, a few could return to their father's house, assuming the father is still alive and could afford it. But most of the time, that was no longer possible. And marriage to someone else was the only option for these women. So
Yeah,
many
and
scholars.
just to jump in here a minute, actually, that's a really important thing for people to grasp, is that Jesus is, so when he says, yeah, if you divorce your wife, you cause her to commit adultery, as in when she inevitably remarries, that's adultery. It's so important to recognize that she is, even if she's the innocent party, even if her husband divorces his wife for a sinful reason, maybe he divorces his wife because he wants to marry another woman or something like that, and she, this innocent party, she's done nothing wrong, she's been unfairly divorced, she remarries, Jesus is saying it's adultery for her to do that. And that's a really powerful statement. And often people, usually not scholars, usually on like a pop level, usually when I talk to sort of regular Christians who aren't scholars, they will usually say, well, Jesus' teachings on divorce is to protect women, but it's not obviously doing that, because it's actually saying even if a woman who's been divorced for no fault of her own remarries, it's adultery. So he's definitely not doing something to protect women or attack the patriarchy or something like that, which is an argument I've heard many times. I don't know if you've heard that from people before, but that's obviously not what's going on. So it's a very powerful thing to reflect on. And then not only that, but then he says, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So even if you're a single guy, you marry this woman, it's adultery to marry her, even if she was unfairly divorced. And that's really, really powerful, very powerful, actually. And I think the only real way to sort of make sense of that is to say that the divorce didn't actually end the marriage, clearly. Anyway, so sorry to cut you off. Back to you.
No, that's
I wanted
fine.
to really highlight
obviously,
that.
we're getting you going here, so
Yeah.
I should interview you.
Yeah.
That's all right. It's a fascinating topic, and inevitably so. And I mean, but when you're talking about protecting the woman, maybe you could say is that you are protecting the woman insofar as a husband is not going to be out divorcing his wife, and it's going to be preserving that original marriage relationship. And that's actually a tremendous gain for women in this society, that with Jesus' teachings, you're just not going to be contemplating divorcing your wife, even though others would say it's perfectly fine, which would really leave her stranded. In that sense, the protection is to follow Jesus' teaching. But I mean, you're right. People talk about all sorts of devices here. So you talk about the divorce certificates that Instant Brewer talk about how if you have the divorce certificate in hand, then the certificate says you're free. So you're free to marry again. Or they'll talk about innocent parties, how they can marry again. And that's what makes this Matthew 5:32 so unexpected, because it just doesn't matter whether you're holding a divorce certificate. It's just irrelevant. It's not even relevant if you're innocent or not, because this was obviously an innocent woman who's being forced to commit adultery and marrying someone else. And the fact that the woman would need to marry again, it's not something that we're reading into the passage, but it's clear already in the second half of the verse when Jesus immediately turns to marrying a divorced woman, because this is what she's going to have to do. So it's not like we're reading the culture into the passage. No, it's already there. So then may the man marry a divorced woman? Jesus says no, or you'd be committing adultery. And he doesn't say anything about whether she's innocent or not. I mean, there's no article here. There's nothing to identify her. It just doesn't matter. So if a woman's divorced and you marry her, regardless of the circumstances, you're adulterating, period. So while Matthew 5:32 does make an exception, this is to permit the divorce in a very specific situation, but the remarriage is categorically adulterous. And so you'll find people using lingo, and it's very confusing lingo. So they'll talk about what constitutes a legitimate divorce, and is there such a thing as a legitimate remarriage? This is popular scholarly lingo and it's the lingo people use when they talk about this passage, legitimate and illegitimate. And what I'd like to do for a second is just demystify the lingo. Later in Matthew's gospel, the Pharisees are going to ask Jesus if a husband may divorce his wife for any reason. In other words, would these divorces be legitimate ones? Well, we might ask the same question here in Matthew 5:32. And Jesus is saying there's almost no such thing as a legitimate divorce, since it is a sin to divorce. The one exception, and then the one legitimate cause for divorce, is when the wife has adulterated. The husband wouldn't be sinning in these cases because she's already adulterated. She's brought this on herself. So Jesus is radically redefining and limiting what divorces are legitimate. And also keep in mind that these exceptions in Matthew are for a Jewish community that often considered remaining with an adulterous spouse itself adulterous. And so Jesus is giving to this Jewish audience, these husbands, an escape clause, lest they be viewed as complicit in that adultery. But then the question is, what of remarriage? Is there a legitimate remarriage in the verse? And notice Jesus never says that the innocent husband of adulterous wife may marry again. He doesn't make that explicit on the part of the husband. So we shouldn't assume a permission where none is given. But then what about the innocent wife divorced by sinful husband? May she marry again? And as you were pointing out a second ago, I mean, the second half of the verse says that anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery, whether she's innocent or not, whether she has a certificate in hand or not. It's quote, all marriage of a divorced woman is simply non-legitimate. It's just adultery. And so we really need to not so much worry about the language of legitimate and illegitimate as simply to follow what Jesus is saying in these passages.
Absolutely, yeah. So even in Matthew 5:32, remarriage is unequivocally prohibited. He says unequivocally, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. But the exception, therefore, is just applying to divorce, as is the plain sense of that passage. Whoever divorces his wife is complicit in her adultery unless he divorced her for sexual immorality, because she's already made herself an adulteress. He's obviously not complicit in that.
You can't make her an adulteress if she's already done it to herself.
Exactly. But it's also important for Jesus to make that exception, just so that people understand that actually, yeah, you can divorce if she is an unrepentant adultery. Otherwise, you'd actually be complicit in her adultery in that case too. If you're living with your wife and she's out sleeping with other men unrepentantly, and you're just sort of sticking with her and everything, you're going to end up being complicit in that adultery. As the Shepherd of Hermas says, you actually have to divorce your wife if she's in adultery, although he'll obviously also say you'll have to take her back if she repents. And so, and that explains why it's only Matthew's gospel that adds the exception clause, because it's only Matthew's gospel that actually specifies that even divorce itself is adultery. The Luke and Mark are just saying remarriage is adultery, and that will of course imply that divorce is a sin as well. But Matthew is the one explicitly saying divorce is adultery, and that's why he's got the exception clause. So it just makes sense of all that.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to look at that Matthew 5:32 as parallel to the other sins that the man is committing.
Yeah. All right. Well, unless you have anything else to say about Matthew 5:32, let's move to Matthew 19:9. That's the big one. I mean, Matthew 5:32 isn't as much of an issue because it is sort of clear in that verse that it is only referring to divorce, the exception clause. But now we have Matthew 19:9, which is whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery against her. So people will say that if you just hear that, it's sort of plain sense as it sounds to your ears, is that he's saying you can not only divorce if your wife committed adultery, but you can also then remarry. That's what people say. And of course, you've got like the more popular level argument, which is that's just sort of what it sounds like Jesus is saying. And then you have the more academic level argument from people like David and Brewer, who'll say that well, if divorce is permitted, then remarriage must be permitted by the culture. We've already talked about that. We looked at how that's not quite true, and Jesus is countercultural anyway, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue what the culture had to say. Well, what do you have to say then about this exception clause in Matthew 19:9? Why would you argue that it's not permitting remarriage?
Yeah, I mean, first you have to keep in mind that our best manuscripts are split on Matthew 19:9. So that was
Yes,
that
that's
question.
actually, I didn't actually know about that. I've been researching this for a while, and I've already made my mind. But then I read in your book. Whoa, hold on a minute. Yeah, let's just talk about that just for a brief moment.
Sure.
About the whole manuscript situation here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some manuscripts have wording in Matthew 19:9 that would have it read identically to Matthew 5:32, which we're just looking at. And so if Matthew 19:9 reads the same as Matthew 5:32, then Jesus is simply granting that a husband divorcing an adulterous wife is not sinning because she's already made herself an adulteress. There's nothing here permitting remarriage, just like there hadn't been in Matthew 5:32. So if that reading is original, then we really don't have any possible gospel passage permitting remarriage. It's just taken off the table. But if we go with the reading that the translators deem most likely, where the wording of Matthew 19:9 differs from Matthew 5:32, then we have a possible permission to marry again. Of course, I mean, isn't it just as likely that someone later on might have wanted to soften Jesus' teaching by inserting a passage that could be understood as permitting remarriage? We talk about the more difficult readings to be preferred, and so this is a reading that differs from Matthew 5:32, but maybe the more difficult reading is actually one that doesn't allow for the culturally accepted remarriage. I mean, again, the ancient manuscripts are pretty well divided here, and that means that our one, I just think it's worth keeping in mind that our one possible permission for marriage in the Gospels is based on a textually disputed passage. But then what I say is, okay, well, let's just take the passage as our modern translations have it and go from there. And then what I argue is that even then, we don't have a clear permission for remarriage. And this is when you get into the grammar of Matthew 19:9. And it turns out the grammar is ambiguous. And so Jesus places an exception clause between two verbs, one for divorce and the other for remarriage. And so the verse reads, I tell you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So the question becomes whether the exception clause modifies only the first verb, permitting divorce, or whether it also modifies the second, permitting also remarriage. And there are a number of reasons why the exception clause really should be taken as going with the first verb, divorce, and not the second. And so this is what's called a Matthean doublet or repeated teaching. We were looking at how Jesus taught on divorce remarriage earlier in Matthew 5:32. It's the first part of this doublet. And in Matthew's doublets, the second instance will typically restate or the first passage or shorten it. So when you go back and you look at Matthew 5:32, we had a prohibition there of divorce, but we did have an exception to permit a divorce in a certain instance, in the instance of adultery. And then remarriage to the divorce is strictly prohibited. So if we understand Matthew 19:9 in the same way as Matthew 5:32, then Jesus would be permitting divorce, but not remarriage. And then that'd be how we should take Matthew chapter 19 to follow that pattern. But also the exception clause is placed between the verbs and not after them both. Between the two verbs instead of after, it would tend to indicate that it modifies only the first verb for the divorcing, but we don't have an exception for the remarrying. And the third reason, the understood verb we have here for our exception, wouldn't that be what we just read and what it preceded? So the clause as you reconstruct it would be, except a man divorces his wife for adultery. Jesus doesn't even get to remarriage until after the exception clause. And still another reason. I mean, the whole point of this conversation had been to address the situation of divorce. The Pharisees had brought it up. They were questioning Jesus about whether divorce is permitted under any circumstance at all. It's divorce that Jesus was answering and was permitting in this one instance. So if Jesus is denying any remarriage after divorce, then also you can understand then why the disciples are reacting to this difficult teaching when they say, well, that's the case. I mean, it's just better not to marry in the first place. So my point here is that the indicators are all pointing to the exception only being for the divorce, with no exception being made to that prohibition of remarrying. And this would agree with Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5. It agrees with Luke 16. It agrees with Mark 10. We can look at 1 Corinthians 7. It would agree with that. They'd all be in agreement. We don't have any permission for remarriage in this verse either. And by the way, several major Matthean commentators have come to this conclusion as well over the years, looking at this ambiguous grammar. So Donald Hagner had done a multi-volume commentary, came to this point of view. Ulrich Lutz in his multi-volume commentary, Warren Carter, Robert Gundry, and that's just to name a few of the scholars of the years who have said that this exception clause really only goes with the first verb and not the second.
Yeah, and so there's a lot to talk about here as well from my angle, like sort of things I'd like to bring up. For starters, people say, well, it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right hearing it. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. But first of all, in English, we can construct sentences this way where you have an exception that only modifies the first part. So, for instance, one I've come up with is whoever breaks into someone's house, unless it's to save his neighbor from a fire, and steals his belongings, commits burglary. So the second part, steals his belongings, well, that's unequivocally burglary. But if you break into the house, that's burglary unless it's to save him from a house fire. So and there's many other cases. One that's been given to me by Jack Shannon, who also wrote a book against remarriage, was whoever hires a hitman, unless it's to do yard work, and then plots to murder someone, is guilty of criminal conspiracy. So, and there's many other cases you can come up with where you have an exception that clearly just modifies the first part, and that doesn't sound strange to us in English, actually. So that's one argument I'd bring up, and the other one is simply that, as you show in your book, until before Nicaea, the church fathers were agreed that you could divorce for adultery, but you could not remarry after the fact, and that means one of two things. It either means that they are all working with a manuscript where Matthew 19:9 is actually just the same as Matthew 5:32. And you've actually argued for that, where it looks like it's not just that we have manuscripts, including the Codex Sinaiticus, right, which is a really important manuscript, doesn't have this reading of Matthew 19:9. But even church fathers, when they quote Matthew 19:9, appear to be quoting it as if it's the same wording as Matthew 5:32. So why are the early church fathers unanimous that you can divorce for adultery, but you can't remarry? It's either because of the manuscript issue, or it's because they, being people who actually spoke that language and were near contemporaries of Jesus, could hear that statement in Matthew 19:9 and not think it's weird that it only modifies divorce.
You're really on the horns of a dilemma there. I mean, either they're witnesses that the best manuscripts or the earliest text simply didn't have the reading of Matthew 19:9 as we have it. That's the one horn of the dilemma. And the other horn of the dilemma is, or they just didn't interpret the same way we do. So it's a very difficult problem, and we just can't dismiss that textual problem too quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, just to remind viewers who are watching, if you've got questions, make sure to put them in the live chat. We've already got a number of questions that we'll be getting to after the sort of main section of the interview is done. Yeah, put them in there, and we will be getting to those. All right. So with Matthew 19:9, we just talked about why we believe it modifies divorce and not remarriage. Well, let's move. Do you want to move on to 1 Corinthians 10:15, or is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure. I'm a Pauline specialist. I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we've looked at the Gospels. We have just before 1 Corinthians 7, there was another point I just wanted to make, which is that from a hermeneutical perspective, first of all, a tried and true practice is that you have the clearer texts interpret the unclear texts. And if Mark 10 and Luke 16 and 1 Corinthians 7 are clear, well, we should be having them interpret the unclear text for us. And the other thing is just to say that if there is now an allowance for remarriage after adultery, if adultery essentially dissolves the marriage and that sort of thing, well, that's actually not taught anywhere explicitly. We don't have any explicit teaching adultery dissolves a marriage. And you don't talk about this in your book, but I've argued it myself that actually when we get to the Old Testament, God's covenant with Israel is likened to a marriage in multiple cases, and Israel's adultery did not actually dissolve it. And you have 1 Corinthians 7:39, where Paul says unequivocally, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, and only once he dies is she free to remarry. And he says the same thing in Romans 7. And so if you're going to now say that adultery dissolves the marriage and allows one to remarry, you're putting an enormous amount of weight and pressure on this exception clause in Matthew 19:9 that I don't think it can sustain. You're actually having to have this one clause in a verse, which is actually just 3 words in Greek, I believe, right? It's actually just not 4 porneia. 3 words. You're having to have 3 words sustain an enormous amount of weight, where that is going to have to be the only place in the Bible where it has a doctrinal teaching that adultery dissolves a marriage, which would then obviously have to drastically change how you interpret Mark 10, Luke 16, Romans 7, and 1 Corinthians 7. And I just don't think that these 3 words can actually bear that much weight that you're putting on it. And it makes more sense to say it modifies divorce, which is already what we saw it do in Matthew 5:32, and not remarriage, and now everything's in harmony and everything makes sense. So yeah, you're really going to have to make a very strong case that an exception clause allows one to remarry. Otherwise, it just cannot handle the amount of weight that you're going to have to put on it.
Yeah, I'm not as keen on the covenant argument. That's in the conclusion, which you'll be looking at shortly, where I talk about that a little bit. But my point is, if you're just reading the Gospels, the point I'm making in the book is just that what does Jesus say in Matthew chapter 19? What does he say in Mark chapter 10? That when people are putting before him the divorce certificates of Deuteronomy 24, Jesus simply goes back to creation. That this doesn't overturn God's will in creation, that there be one man. God's will is that there be one man and one woman in the marriage. And so that will of God in creation remains normative, regardless of how we muck it up. So you may have to divorce. There may be a divorce, and it's a genuine divorce in cases of sexual sin. But that doesn't overturn that God's will had always been for the one man and the one woman. So that's why Matthew can allow for the divorce, but not the remarriage, because it never overturns that original will.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get to 1 Corinthians 7 then. So 1 Corinthians 7:15 is another verse that people bring up that allows someone to remarry according to this view. It is often called the Pauline permission or the Pauline privilege. So do you want to just read that out for us, maybe even a few verses before, just for context, and then we'll look at it. What do you think is happening?
Yeah, let me back up then to verses 10 and 11, because that's really where we get started on this. We have in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 11, where Paul is recording Jesus' teaching there as well, and has Jesus saying, he'll say here, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. So we should just linger for a moment over verses 10 and 11. It's a shocking couple of verses in the ancient world where, again, divorce and remarriage were freely permitted to Paul's Gentile audiences here. We get a twofold command emphasizing there's no divorce, whether for the husband or for the wife. But then you also notice that Jesus envisions that a divorce nevertheless still just might take place. But if the wife does, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Paul says nothing here about innocent parties or guilty parties. Again, it's irrelevant. If a divorce takes place, she must remain single or be reconciled to her former husband. So there's no remarriage to another party permitted, period. Just reconciliation to the former spouse. So Jesus' teaching here, as Paul relays it is the same as what we're seeing in the gospel text. And in fact, this is one of our witnesses to Jesus' teaching. But then we then move to the next paragraph, and that's verses 12 to 16. Well, people are overlooking all the time when they look at this next paragraph, this Pauline privilege, Pauline permission, that when you read verses 12 to 16, these verses never actually mention remarriage. It's just not a topic that he's talking about, and yet we have a supposed permission for it here. But wait a minute, they'll say. In verse 15, doesn't Paul say that a divorced spouse is not bound in these instances? And doesn't that mean that the spouse can marry again? And that's the reasoning. But Paul didn't actually say that the spouse is, quote, not bound. It's a mistranslation. He didn't say that. He does use bound language for marriage. Had he actually said not bound, then perhaps a remarriage might have been possible. At least it'd be a stronger argument. But instead, Paul reserves this phrase not bound to two passages. It's in 1 Corinthians 7:39, and it's in Romans 7:2-3. And it's for the widow, that she, the widow, is, quote, free to marry again since her spouse has died. And those are the only two places in Paul where he's allowing for remarriage, and in both cases it's for the widow. And when you look at verse 15 again, 1 Corinthians 7:15, you notice there's no freedom language. And you remember, that was characteristic of the divorce certificates. That was what you'd be looking for. It's just not here. You had it with the widow in verse 39, but you don't have it here. Instead, you have him using the word not enslaved rather than not bound. It's not enslaved. So Paul, in his wording of verse 15, appears to be avoiding the very conclusion that people are wanting him to make. So then the next question is, well, then why does Paul choose not enslaved? Well, Paul's going to be talking about slavery under the law all through his letters. He'll talk about it elsewhere, especially in Romans. He'll talk about it in Galatians. And we do have a sort of law here in verses 10 to 15. I mean, so if you just listen to these verses being read, starting at verse 10, you'll be struck. And what he did in the book is I put it in bold so you could see it more clearly. And it just kind of sticks out. But how often does Paul say here or urge that no divorce is to take place? It's repeated. It's over and over again. So the wife is not to divorce her husband. The husband is not to divorce his wife. He must not divorce her. She must not divorce her husband. Over and over again, there's no divorce. But finally, if the unbeliever insists on it, in that case, the believing spouse is not enslaved. And so you would ask, enslaved to what? Well, this repeated command not to divorce. And then what you have then is that you notice that Paul's instructions are lining up perfectly with Jesus' command back in verses 10 and 11, that there be no divorce. But Jesus had envisioned that a divorce might still take place. And so what Paul does here is he calls for peace in the midst of the divorce, but not for remarriage. So should a divorce take place, we'd go back to Jesus' command in those verses earlier, and the spouses remain single or be reconciled. Nowhere is the wife, quote, free to remarry. Nowhere is she no longer bound, to use the language of marriage. And another interesting fact that's not often accounted for, Stoic and Cynic philosophers of the day like to use enslaved language for marriage. It'd be nice if our translations had not enslaved, because then you'd see that connection to the Stoic and Cynic language more easily. But the idea was that marriage was kind of like slavery. So if a spouse is no longer enslaved to the marital relationship, if you're no longer enslaved, well, wouldn't it be good from that standpoint to remain single, to remain in that unenslaved state? Wouldn't that be the preferred state if you were a Cynic or a Stoic? Why would we be assuming a remarriage here? So just to sum this all up, Paul doesn't mention remarriage here, and he certainly is not providing it as an option. Paul's admitted opinion is not overturning Jesus' command, an explicit command in verses 10 and 11. They are in perfect agreement with each other. He's just allowing the believer to let the non-believer go through with the divorce, that there may be peace in that situation.
Yeah, again, and like we just talked about Matthew 19:9, if you're going to say that this allows one to remarry. And of course, Paul just doesn't say that. He doesn't even mention remarriage. You're once again putting enormous amount of weight on this verse, which if you think allows remarriage, you'd have to agree is at least ambiguous. And we'd say it's actually not ambiguous. But if you think it's about remarriage, you'd have to say it is. And it's an amount of pressure that it just can't sustain. And so just to sort of back up your point, I'll just read this passage again so that people can sort of see how it goes. Paul says, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord." So he's reiterating the Lord's commandments. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. That's important to note. So verse 12 and 13 now says, even if they're an unbeliever, you can't divorce them. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So now Paul's making quite clear that even if they're an unbeliever, they're still, to sort of use Roman Catholic language, the marriage is still valid. It's still a valid marriage. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't be saying this. So just to reiterate, verse 12 and 13, Paul has given a commandment. The commandment is, even if your spouse is an unbeliever, you must not divorce them because they're made holy by you. And now verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. So not enslaved to the commandment to not divorce. And that makes sense. And now later on in verse 39, the same chapter, he'll say a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And if he dies, she's then free to remarry. If Paul was making an exception to that commandment, you'd want him to use the word bound, not enslaved. So yeah, it all just sort of fits together quite nicely now.
Well, and that argument can be sharpened even a tad further. If you remember here that I mean, we have a Pauline permission here, but the Pauline permission really isn't to divorce. It has nothing to do with remarriage. It's a permission to allow yourself to be divorced. And the fact that remarriage isn't anywhere on the horizon here is the fact that Paul immediately in verse 16 returns to his hope for that original marriage. So we've not even left the original marriage behind in his thinking here in verse 16 after we're allowing for it. So there's always that hope for the original marriage. And so if Paul has a hope for the original marriage in verse 16 after allowing for the divorce, isn't the same thing again we saw in verses 10 to 11 where the Lord's holding out hope for reconciliation.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So let's move on then. And this actually relates to a question that was in the chat. So we will answer this one now. Someone in the chat asked that he quoted verse 27 to 28, which your book gets into. And all he did is just he just quoted it. So I imagine, and he said it was a question. So I imagine he's saying, what do you think of this? So in verse, well, actually, before we get to verse 27, 28, it's probably important to get to verse 8 to 9, isn't it? To sort of see where Paul's going. So do you want to just talk a little bit about this whole situation, about his advice to the unmarried, his advice to widows, and then also leading into verse 27, 28, what are these verses saying, and do they allow one to remarry?
Yeah, I mean, so in the chapter I have on 1 Corinthians 7, I talk about pressure points in the chapter. And so certainly the main pressure point is going to be verses 10 to 16, but you have at least two really strong pressure points where people will see potential freedom to marry again in verses 8 to 9 or in verses 27 to 28 as we have in the chat. Verses 8 to 9 seem at first to be permitting remarriage because Paul writes to the unmarried and the widows. I say it's well for them to remain unmarried as I am, but if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it's better to marry than to be aflame with passion. So if you think of the unmarried in the broad sense, including also the divorced, well, then the flames of passion, the need for self-control would presumably require them to marry again. But as much as we're sympathetic to that reading, it's unlikely. And you have to keep in mind that there's no corresponding word for widower in this era of Greek. So paired with the word for widows, that word could be it may be translated elsewhere as unmarried, but in this particular context, paired with widow, the word would mean widower. And so if that's the case, then you have a widows and widower pairing that then neatly matches the other parallel mutual relations we have all through verses 1 through 16. So to give you a little bit of running start, you have in verse 2 that a man will have his own wife and the wife will have her own husband. Notice how it's mutual there. It's parallel. In verse 3, the husband is to allow conjugal rights to the wife and the wife to the husband. In verse 4, the husband has rights over the wife's body and vice versa. In verses 10 and 11, you have the wife does not separate from the husband, nor the reverse. In verses 12 to 13, the believing husband does not divorce his wife, nor the believing wife her husband. And then in verses 14 to 15, the unbelieving husband is made holy by the believing wife, even as the unbelieving wife is made holy by the believing husband. And then in verse 16, that last verse of the section, a believing wife might save the husband and the believing husband his wife. So what that means is with this neat pairing all through these 16 verses, that means in verses 8 to 9, we have the same situation in view here. We're talking about widows and widowers. And it makes sense because there was tremendous pressure in Roman society, socially, both for widows and for widowers to remarry. I mentioned earlier Emperor Augustus's legislation, but it would restrict the rights of inheritance for men who had not married or who had not had children. So widowers between the ages of 25 and 60 were required to remarry by law if they're going to obey it, but very shortly after the deaths of their spouses. So for people under this pressure to marry again from their society, Paul is permitting it. Now, a reference to widowers alongside widows would also avoid inconsistencies with the rest of the chapter, especially with verses 10 to 11 right after this that require singleness after the divorce. And I think you have to look at a reading that's sensible in light of the fullness of the chapter. Paul does not mention the betrothed or the engaged, unmarried. He's not using unmarried in that very broad sense to include the never married. He won't talk about them until later in the chapter. And then when he does explicitly allow for remarriage, which he'll do in verse 39, he'll allow it for the widow, but not for someone else. So this is not a reference to unmarried people in general. This is widowers and widows that Paul's talking about there. And ideally they should remain single as Paul himself is. But if they can't, they have that permission to marry again, which is consistent with verse 39 and the widow there. But that leaves the other set of verses that a person in the chat mentioned. And so some have found permission to remarry again in verses 27 to 28. And those verses read, "Are you bound to a wife? Well, do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. However, if you do get married, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned." So is this release from a wife? Would this be a divorce? You could see how people might read it that way, and scholars have. But this conclusion, too, proves to be problematic. Be a nice justification for a marriage if it worked. But Paul's signaling a new topic here in verse 25, that he's going to be talking about the betrothed, the engaged. He's not talking here about divorce or marriage. That's not his topic. And Paul says in verse 25 that he does not have a command of the Lord about the matters he's talking about and writing about here. But you remember the Lord did forbid remarriage in verses 10 and 11. And so that means that the topic here must be different, that we're not talking about divorce and remarriage in verses 27 and 28. And now Paul does use the language of bound here, but you remember that's contract language. So it's normal for betrothal contracts. And another hint that we're talking about betrothal here and not the divorce. And the word loosed or released in these verses. You have to keep in mind it was never used in antiquity for divorce. David Inson Brewer tried to find one instance of it, and I just point out in the footnote, no, we were talking about a bank contract. We weren't talking about a marriage there. So this is not language used in antiquity to be released or divorced from a wife. This is to be released from a contract, from your betrothal contract. And then finally, Paul continues his balanced pairings on the whole, even here in this latter part of 1 Corinthians 7. And so the virgin who marries is balanced by the never married man who's marrying in the first part of verse 28. So you should not assume a divorced man from verse 27. In fact, verse 28 would make no sense had verse 27 been about divorce. So this is a paragraph about virgins. These verses are about whether a man engaged with a woman should follow through with the marriage, or should he be released from that betrothal contract. If he follows through and marries his betrothed, it's not a sin. And if the virgin marries, she is not sinned. There's just nothing here about divorce and remarriage this part of the chapter. But it's an important question to ask.
Yeah. What I would add to that is just that I find it odd that people would go into this verse assuming it allows for remarriage for divorced people, because if it did, then it's just a blatant contradiction then of Jesus' teachings and what Paul has just said in the same chapter, where he says, if you're divorced, you must remain unmarried or else reconcile. So now not only would Paul just be totally contradicting himself, but he'd be blatantly contradicting Jesus. And we know he's aware of what Jesus said, because he earlier said, the Lord says this, not I. And you'd have to account for that. Well, hold on a minute. So he's just contradicting Jesus. Oh, if you're divorced, you can remarry now. So yeah, we have to say, well, if we believe the Bible is inspired by the Holy Ghost, we're going to have to say, well, this can't just be a contradiction. And it just so happens that the other explanation makes more sense anyway.
But it's an incoherent argument in 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah.
It's coherent. If you just take it the way it lays itself out. Paul's dealing with different situations in each of the paragraphs along the way in 1 Corinthians chapter 7.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Okay, well, looking at the time, we've got 40 minutes to go. I want to get to the questions in the chat. That might take about 20 minutes. So we got a little bit of time. I think I was going to ask you about the 1 Timothy 3:2, where it says that if you're going to be ordained, you have to be the husband of one wife. Could you just give us a quick answer to that one?
Yeah.
Is this referring to divorce and remarriage?
Yeah, we can keep this one brief. I mean, I think that a reference to marital status makes the best sense of those verses there. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. It's in Titus 1. You have a reference in 1 Timothy 5. But the bottom line here is that those laboring in the public ministry should be one spouse people. Now, if you look around the commentary literature, some have thought we have a reference to polygamy here. I said earlier, I just don't think that polygamy was widespread enough among Greeks, Romans, and Jews to get that kind of airtime. Others have thought that the husband of one wife is a reference to being faithful to your spouse. It's about spousal fidelity and not about having only one spouse. But there is a distinctive grammatical stress here on the one spouse. It doesn't make sense had only faithfulness been in view. And to appeal back to the language we were looking at earlier, we were looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the requirement of one spouse. And some of those documents, we were talking about the Greek inscriptions. We're talking about the Greek romance novels praising the one spouse person. We have the Roman literature, the traditions of Univira. We have even the one spouse ideal praised in Virgil's Aeneid. So it's throughout the Roman world. So this minority tradition has wide enough currency to render comprehensible what we're reading here in 1 Timothy 3:2, that this is a qualification for pastors and ministers in the church to be one women men. And likewise, the widow in 1 Timothy 5 is to be a widow who has had one husband. Of course, I think if churches were the practice today, it'd be pretty radical.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Well, let's look at the early church before we get to the questions in the chat. And we've got a little time. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about what we should be doing with this teaching. So your book looks at the early church fathers on divorce and remarriage up to the First Council of Nicaea. And what would you say about them in general? What do they teach? Are they unanimous? Is there some disagreement? Yeah.
Yeah, sure, sure. What I'm arguing I have a chapter devoted to this. Some people said, well, couldn't you have done another chapter on after Nicaea? It's just that then we'd probably need 2 or 3 chapters because there's just so much more ground to cover. So for the sake of page length, I limit myself to Nicaea, the first 300 years of Christianity, but you just don't have an early Christian author anywhere in that period advocating for remarriage after divorce. You have several councils, you have several authors talking about it, just no sanction for it. And the first Christians, they were taking their lead from Jesus' countercultural teaching. So it was no less countercultural in their own day because divorces and remarriages were freely practiced for the first Christians too. We've talked here about the Shepherd of Hermas a bit already, written in the Roman Church in the early part of the 2nd century. What I find striking is that an angel reveals to Hermas that after a divorce, the spouses must remain single or be reconciled to their former partners. And it's the same thing that the Lord had commanded here in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11. But what I find interesting is that Hermas then struggles mightily, and it's not with remarriage after divorce, but whether remarriage is even possible if a spouse had died. And he's so concerned about this that it takes angelic revelation to calm his nerves about the possibility of remarrying when a spouse has died. There was this tension that the first Christians felt between the one spouse of 1 Timothy chapter 3 and then Paul's provision for the widow or widow to marry again. And so how do you resolve that tension? And so he's not sure about it, and the angel says it's okay. That was a hot issue for him. Remarriage after divorce was simply inconceivable. And we mentioned earlier about how scholars try to get around this. They'll talk about how repentance is so important for Hermas, but then repentance figures all through the document. And so this is not a surprise here. The main thing is just that even in this passage, there's just no provision for the remarriage, and it's just very difficult even after the spouse has died. That it's shocking. We see the same thing in the middle of the 2nd century. So if we move slight bit forward, Justin Martyr, he'll condemn the twice married is a phrase he uses, but he's using this phrase twice married in the context of quoting Matthew 5:32 about divorce and possible remarriage. So there's just nothing about an innocent party here. It's just categorically sin. Move to the latter part of the 2nd century of Athenagoras. He'll write that a person should either remain as he was born or be content with one marriage. For a second marriage is only specious adultery. You shouldn't have a second marriage. So, it's what I find really interesting, and I try to trace this through the book, is that even modern advocates of remarriage, like Inson Brewer, have noted how regularly the early Christians in these centuries called remarriage after divorce adulterous. And so, when they say that divorce automatically assumed the remarriage, but obviously it doesn't for the first Christians. So if it doesn't for the first Christians, why should it for the biblical authors? And so it's a difficult question that Inson Brewer can't answer for himself. At least so far. I'm sure he'll have a response to the book.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point to bring up. The early church, you're a Lutheran, I'm an Anglican. We believe they have a lot of authority in and of themselves anyway. But yeah, it does seem to sort of debunk his argument that if someone heard Jesus say you can divorce, that must mean you can remarry. But then they acknowledge that the early church didn't see it that way. So yeah,
and he'll concede it.
Yeah, but I mean, as I said before, I just found it a little bit odd that you referred to these scholars. And they were trying to say that some of these guys who are very clearly teaching against remarriage, they'll try and say, oh, well, maybe. And it's, yeah, that was.
Well, I think it's important to see. I'm trying to document all of the save devices that are used in this discussion, but I'm not saying it up front, but implicit in the arguments. I'm hoping people see the variety, the extent to which people will cling to different types of devices along the way to avoid what I think is the plain sense of the text. And so all we can do is demystify it, just take these points one by one, and as they unravel, you just it just reveals that sometimes that when the arguments just don't carry the weight they're supposed to carry, I think that they're betraying a desire to have the text read in a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So your book shows that, until, your book ends at Nicaea 1, but at the very least, before then, the fathers were unequivocal that you can't remarry after divorce. Now, most scholars acknowledge that, right? I mean, some try and get out of it, but most do acknowledge that.
They just dismiss
And
it.
yeah, but often how they'll dismiss it is they'll say, okay, well, that's because these church fathers were heavily influenced by this sort of anti-marriage viewpoint. They were. I often struggle to pronounce the word. They were aesthetics, right? They just, you have people like later on, you have guys like Jerome say the only good of marriage is to produce more virgins. And maybe these early church fathers are being influenced by this view as well. So maybe because they think that marriage is sort of not great anyway, like maybe you shouldn't get married at all. Maybe they're just going to say, okay, fine, you can get married. We'd rather you didn't, but you can. But you can't get remarried because that's just getting a bit extreme, isn't it? And so they'll say that maybe that's what's going on. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's an important question, and here's why. Even though Instone Brewer and others said that divorce in the ancient world, I can't stress this enough, that it always entails a corresponding freedom to marry again. Again, he's just fully admitting here that the first centuries didn't permit remarriage after divorce. So first of all, they're freely granting that conclusion, which I think is really significant because these are people who are highly resistant to that conclusion. And so, again, if the first Christians didn't think a divorce certificate entailed a corresponding freedom to marry again, why is it so countercultural or outlandish for Jesus to have taught so, or for the apostles to have taught so? Why can't there be Christian authors say the same thing? But then some will say then in response, as you're pointing out, that the first Christians were getting influenced by their larger world to take this radical stance against remarriage. They were what were called ascetics, who didn't believe in sexual relations. They didn't believe in marriage. They'd want people to abstain from marriage, preferably to stay single. And the first Christians were influenced by this. So Craig Keener, David Instone Brewer both believed that the early Christian witness against remarriage should be dismissed because they were just too influenced by the ascetic currents of their later day. In fact, Bill Heth, he even attributed his change of mind on remarriage, largely to his conclusion that the first Christians were just radical ascetics, and thus very different from what we see in the pages of the New Testament. They were being too influenced by their surrounding culture for us to take that witness seriously. So then the question is, well, were the first Christians ascetic? And what often goes unmentioned is that asceticism, it's very tricky. It's actually very difficult to define. And so it typically involves depriving yourself of bodily desires, usually food or sex. So were the first Christians ascetic? But how is it ascetic in the typical sense when the first Christians valued marriage between a man and a woman? I mean, they may not have allowed for remarriage, but they certainly permitted the first marriage. So Callistus Ware, it was an important essay, and I highlighted it in the book, but he distinguished early Christian ascetic patterns of thought from others. And so the first Christians were always world affirming. They were never world denying. They weren't like other ascetics. So you would withdraw from your bodily desires for a time, but not because the material world or the material creation was somehow bad, but it was to serve the Lord more fully and to serve your fellow human beings. And so you would withdraw for a time only to re-engage that world. So if you're going to disqualify the first Christians for ascetic elements in their teachings, and this is very common in the commentaries, I can't tell you how many gospel commentators will just dismiss the early Christian witness. Well, we're going to have to throw out Jesus and Paul as well, because the very same elements are present there in the pages of the New Testament. Jesus will tell men that lusting after a woman is adultery in Matthew chapter 5, even to lust. In Luke chapter 14, verse 26 and 18:29, Jesus asked husbands, quote, to hate their wives and even to leave them for the sake of more wholehearted ministry. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, the Corinthians are thinking that it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, Paul disagrees for the sake of a married couple, but even so, they should abstain from sex for a time for the sake of prayer, if it's possible. Widows and widowers should remain single as he is, if at all possible. Paul will warn the married that they will experience trouble in this life in 1 Corinthians 7:28. And then he says, you really should be living as if the present form of this world is passing away. I mean, marriage really is something you don't need to worry about if you can get away with it. In verses 32 to 35, he says that an unmarried person can serve the Lord more fully and without distraction than the married person who has a spouse. And even the widow in 1 Corinthians 7:39 will do better to remain single rather than to remarry. So celibacy is clearly superior to marriage in this chapter, but the marriage is still acceptable. So the first Christians, including Jesus and Paul, were ascetics. They just weren't extreme. So if we're going to dismiss the first Christians, we really should keep in mind that they were just striking the same balance in their teaching as Jesus and the apostles. We have to dismiss the New Testament as well. And it's why their teaching on remarriage, divorce, remarriage in these early centuries so regularly appeals to New Testament passages as they're trying to balance and figure out how to apply those New Testament passages in their teaching. They're taking their cues from the New Testament itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you for that. Is there anything else you want to comment on with the early church before we move on?
Oh, I think we've gotten through the basics. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I mean, I see that we've been, I think, doing this for about 90 minutes, so we've covered some ground.
Yeah. Well, no, it's been brilliant so far. Thank you so much for everything that you've been saying. It's been great. Okay, well, maybe we'll get into the live chat because I had another question about sort of how we apply this to life and that sort of thing. I think you and I have some disagreement over that, and I think that will come up as we go through these questions. But maybe just before we get to those, how have you sort of found the reception to your book and from a pastoral perspective, and yeah, like, has there been pushback? Have you? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the book just came out at the end of June. But to give you a couple examples, the former pastor of my church, I mean, he doesn't even want to talk about the topic. I mean, he'll just kind of almost kind of a pained look on his face when the topic of this book comes up. So I was doing a podcast last week on it with Scott McKnight, and he's on the other side of this as I am. He's in print. On the other side, but you can just tell from his body language at times as we're doing the podcast that this is just really uncomfortable teaching for him, as it would be for most people. But I just, and really, Tom Schreiner was interesting, his response, because we were both on the Christian Standard Bible translation committee together years ago, and I'd asked him what he thought about this, and he did a little. I guess a little Twitter feed where he showed the book and said it's causing him to rethink things. But and we talked about it a little bit later on, but I think his response is the same as mine, that we really, we put this out there with the book, and so now we just need to give people a chance to digest the arguments, and then how then will you construct the arguments in view of the book? Will you ignore the book as an inconvenient truth, or will you, how will you engage it? And so maybe there are areas that need more study, more analysis. So it's kind of a wait and see at this point.
Sure.
But it's just too early to know. But there is a lot of discomfort, I mean, understandably, with where this book ends up.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've been talking to people about this for a while, and there's a number of people I know who, after our conversations and us opening the scriptures up together and going through the text together, I managed to change their mind, and they believe that remarriage is always adultery. And a couple of them, a couple of months later, will come back and say, "Oh, no, I'm back to thinking you can remarry after adultery." And in both those instances, that was because they became friends of someone who's remarried, and they just think, "Oh, how can I?" And it is usually of a more emotional nature, and that people don't want to accept this. And the thing that sometimes bothers me a bit is a lot of the arguments were almost, again, talking like a sort of pop level. We're not talking about scholars here, just talking about average people. By far the most common arguments I hear against this position that remarriage is adultery are pretty much the exact same arguments that I will hear against people from people who disagree with my stance against, for instance, same-sex marriage or homosexual practices, and often from people who are otherwise conservative. So these are people who wouldn't accept someone saying, "Oh, it's unfair to say that gay people have to be celibate, or that gay couples have to split up. That's unfair." But then they'll say the exact same thing to me, and they won't often realize the inconsistency there. And I find that a bit odd as well. And it does seem to be that sometimes in the conservative branches of the church, there is, and it's commendable that they have this, they do have a unified voice against homosexual sexual sins, but they seem to be much more lenient with the fact with heterosexual sins that the Bible is equally clear about. Yeah. And I find that that's something that should be responded to as well, because we don't want to be seen to be hypocrites or anything like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, if this is true, I mean, if this is so, I mean, if this is a proper interpretation of Scripture, as I believe it is, then it's a wonderful tool to lead Christians astray, to destroy homes, families, marriages, and the church has advocated on its witness in those years, at least since Nicaea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, well, let's look at the live chat then. So we have one guy who's been asking lots of questions. We're not going to answer all of his questions. We want to get to the ones that are more targeted to this conversation. So the first question is, have you gentlemen seen the 3-hour-long video from the Eastern Orthodox YouTuber Ubi Petrus? Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
I've seen it. It's on YouTube. And basically, he goes through the early church fathers on divorce and remarriage. He's arguing, because he's Eastern Orthodox, he believes you can remarry after adultery. And he's particularly drawing attention to church fathers well after Nicaea 1. So getting into the, even into the Middle Ages. And so, yeah, I've seen it. My quick response would be that, he does show that there were many, I wouldn't really want to call them early church fathers, actually. When we're getting as late as like the 9th century, the 8th century, for me as a Protestant, especially as someone who, as viewers on this channel will know, I'm well known in my strong opposition to the Second Council of Nicaea, and I see that as being a breaking point for the church, where we really started to move into dangerous territory with false teaching. Frankly, if it's a father after Nicaea 2, particularly in the East, they start to lose quite a lot of credibility from me. I think at that time there was a lot of syncretism with surrounding cultures as well. So I'm not too fazed by what he has to say some of the Eastern guys taught at those later dates. I will say how he interprets some of the early fathers, I think a good case can be made that a lot of the people he thinks allow a remarriage actually don't. So I would say for people who've watched that video, do also read the article from Eric Ybarra, Roman Catholic theologian, who also documented what the early church taught on divorce and marriage. And of course, this book as well, which gets into the fathers in detail before Nicaea 1. Anything you want to say about that, Andrew? The later fathers, especially in the East, do seem to eventually allow for remarriage.
Yeah, I do want to say a little bit about it, because I mean, even immediately after Nicaea, you still have a very strong witness, and so I mean, I'm thinking of Jerome in the East. You still have these strong statements against remarriage after divorce there as well. It's a minority position in those first couple centuries, but at the same time, I would just stress it's not surprising to see that. In fact, it's what you would expect to see. So you have this dominant view immediately after Nicaea in that century or so afterward, where remarriage after divorce is still adulterous. But you now have this minority voice creeping in, and think why? Because what's going on in the fourth century? You have an influx of the masses into the church, because the church has now become something acceptable. It's if the emperor has become Christian, then maybe we should too. So there are these masses streaming into the church, and they're bringing with them a morality that comes with them from their larger world. And so there's those cultural pressures where, the church had been before somewhat unique and isolated from this. Now those cultural pressures are within the church, and very strong. So we shouldn't be surprised after the fourth century to start seeing these voices popping up. What I find amazing, if I had to do another chapter on this, would be to stress that dominant strain in the face of those larger societal pressures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is, of course, what you'd expect to see is what we've seen in the 20th century, where mainline churches generally have gone very liberal and allow even homosexuality, and that's clearly because they've been influenced by the culture. So it's not. Yeah, it's really not much of an issue. I'll read some of the nice comments. We got someone say, "Thank you for touching base on such a neglected and avoided topic in the West." And yeah, it is neglected and avoided. We've already looked a little bit as to why. I do think there is. Yeah, there's a sense in which conservatives are not all I mean, I'm obviously a conservative Christian, you're a conservative Christian, but it is true that there are some conservative Christians who have no problem throwing stones at homosexual sins, which is fair enough. Those are sins that must be repented of, but are unwilling to look at heterosexual sins, usually because they're the ones who, like, if you're not. If you're straight, if you're not gay, you've never had attraction to someone of the same sex, you can't empathize with them. Then you're more willing to just give a blanket condemnation. If it's a sin you can empathize with, maybe you could understand and imagine a scenario where you'd want to divorce your wife and remarry. Then you're less willing to condemn it, and that's just human nature. But I do think also it seems to be that because the Presbyterians, particularly because they have it in the Westminster Confession. But I have to say, Andrew, the Lutherans as well, us Anglicans, we had 500 years of consistent teaching against remarriage until we went liberal. But with Luther and Calvin allowing remarriage after adultery, I do think that's had a bad impact, where a lot of people, and I love Luther, I love Calvin, they're two of my great heroes, even though they disagree with each other on some things. I do have to say, I do think that they were wrong about that. And I think they've had a bad impact in that sense, because a lot of people who love them will just say, well, Luther taught that you can remarry after adultery, and Luther's Luther, so that's just my default position. But of course, both Luther and Calvin would say that if we believe in sola scriptura, we have to reform the church in accordance with scripture. And so we would have to say that they're not infallible, that only the scriptures are infallible. They got something wrong. And so we have to now clean that up and fix that. I mean, Calvin was also wrong about a number of moral issues. I think Calvin was too lenient on usury, for instance, which also has led to some problems. But yeah, so that's that. Anything you want to say about that, Andrew, about why this is sort of so neglected?
Well, I think that it's really difficult when you're going against a lot of momentum that's in a different direction. And so all I can hope is that people will examine the individual arguments used, the warrants for that position, and see if they make biblical sense. That's all I can do. And I know but I mean, a lot of Lutherans in my own tradition, I think this book may be something that just gets ignored.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thankfully, when Heth and Wenham wrote that book, Jesus and Divorce, in the 80s, that did make a bit of a splash. And so that's good. And then, of course, you still got John Piper and Voddie Baucham today with the no remarriage position as well. So it is there. It is there. I'm hoping that your book will turn more people to this view. Okay, so another question. If the husband is supposedly dead, the wife marries another man, but then it is known that the first spouse is alive, should the woman leave the second husband even if that man truly loved her? This guy in the chat, he's sort of asking a lot of these sort of hypothetical scenarios. Before we don't even have to answer this question because he's got a lot. Before we get to that, maybe it's just important to note that people always gonna be able to come up with hypotheticals that pose difficult pastoral scenarios. I think that with this video that we're making here, it's very important that we just get the issue, the doctrinal position correct, that remarriage is adultery. When we get to all these hypothetical pastoral scenarios, what if my husband's in a coma? All that stuff? That's when you have to go to a pastor, to your pastor, who is trained and is led by the Spirit to apply the doctrine to these situations. So I don't. It's probably not quite appropriate for Andrew and I to be going. We're not canon lawyers. We're going to go through every single possible scenario and sort it out for you, the viewers. Often there's difficult situations that a pastor needs to be looking at, need to be seeking wise counsel on. Maybe we'll just briefly mention what our position is, though, on the general pastoral application. As I've talked about in my sermon, which is linked in the description below. But I'll just say now, description below, I've got an article of mine that's published. I've got a sermon of mine. I've also posted a link to where you can purchase this book from the publisher's own website. So you can choose sort of where to get it from. Probably not Amazon for various reasons. Yes, and so in the sermon, and I'll say now, I do believe that if you are remarried and you've discovered this teaching, maybe you've read Andrew's book and you go, oh my gosh, I think I've committed adultery in my remarriage. My position is that if you don't have children, you should separate and then either reconcile with your first wife or become celibate for the rest of your life, unless your first wife dies. If you have children with your second spouse, then I believe that you should, because of your duty to raise your children well, you should probably still live with your spouse, raise the children together, but I do believe that you need to become celibate. And so that will probably involve things like sleeping in a separate bedroom to your spouse. And that is the position of the Roman Catholic Church, although I know a lot of Roman Catholic priests, and as far as I understand it, almost no one actually applies that today, but that is sort of the official position. It's called a Josephite marriage, or sort of celibate marriage. That's what I believe. Reason why I think that is because in Matthew 19, right after Jesus talks about the divorce and remarriage thing, he then says that some make themselves eunuchs, that is to say, make themselves celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. I believe that because he's just talked about how remarriage is adultery, it would seem to suggest that he's saying that people who are remarried need to become celibate in order to inherit the kingdom. As Paul says, adulterers can't inherit the kingdom. And then in 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul says that a husband and wife should sleep together, he says, I say this as a concession and not as a command. It would be better to be like I am, which is to say celibate. So I think that if sex is a thing that married couples should do in order to not fall into a greater sin of fornication or adultery, well, if by two people sleeping together it is adultery because it's an adulterous marriage, well, then this concession is now off the table, I believe, and you should be celibate. And people will say, well, that's very difficult, or maybe even that's unfair. I've heard people say that before. Well, no, because Paul's actually said that being celibate is superior to being married and to having sex anyway. And we have centuries of church fathers, very wise, godly men, affirming that celibacy is superior to having sexual intercourse with your wife because it helps you to resist the flesh and focus more on the spiritual things. So I don't think you can really say that a remarried couple should be having sex for those reasons. That's my position. What about you, Andrew? If you want to state it, and then once we do that, a lot of these questions in the chat will probably just end up answering themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, how do we apply this teaching in our churches today? It's a difficult question. It's an important question, especially in a modern world that's so accepting of divorce or a marriage. I think the exception had been the Roman Catholic Church, but 2015, Pope Francis held a meeting of the bishops, and they concluded it's important to offer the remarried sensitive pastoral care. So even the Roman Catholic Church is now softening its resistance to remarriage. And as for the Roman Catholics and divorce, many conservative Catholics over the years have been really objecting to how the Catholic Church has been granting annulments for virtually everything. So,
Yeah.
they may not permit divorce in most instances, but they're pretty generous with the annulments, which really ends up in
Very
the same
generous.
place as the
Yeah.
Protestants with their divorces. So,
And also, it's also important to know, just because I'm aware that some people might hear this and then they start to think, oh, is Roman Catholicism true? Because here on YouTube, the apologetic debates are raging all the time. We actually disagree with their position anyway, because they actually believe in what's called the Pauline privilege in 1 Corinthians 10:15, whereas we don't. So even then, I would say our position in terms of the doctrinal position is actually stricter than their view anyway, because they allow remarriage for people whose unbelieving spouses divorce them. And then, yeah, of course, with the annulment situation, that's a loophole where they effectively do allow remarriage after a divorce. They'll just call it an annulment, and they'll come up with all kinds of reasons to annul you. You might just, all you have to say really is, as far as I've heard from people, is you can just say, well, I wasn't properly pastorally counseled before my marriage. So when I gave the vows, I didn't really know what I was saying. I didn't really know what I was getting into. And they say, well, okay, well, they can annul. This happens quite often. So yeah, don't, for people watching this, don't get too worried. Is the Roman Catholic Church the one true church or something? It's, this is a situation that everyone's in, where even the Roman Catholics, all of Christendom really has made some real errors with this issue. So yeah. Anyway, over to you, Andrew, about your pastoral application.
Yeah. So to get back to that answer that I was giving you there. So in the introduction to the book, I have this short section talking about statistics for remarriage. And it turns out that in any given marriage, at least 1/3 of the marriages include at least one partner who's remarried after divorce. And sadly, it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about married couples in the church or outside of it. The stats are pretty much the same. So what that means is that when you enter any given church, or whether it's a pulpit and worship or an adult Bible study or a Sunday school class, you're likely in a church and a church body that fully endorses both divorce and remarriage. Well, the book, though, is about what the early Christians believed, both the biblical authors and those who followed them in those first few centuries. So if the first Christians had this view that remarriage is adulterous, and that's going to especially impact those who want to base their beliefs on the Bible. It's going to be hard to avoid. And that means that in any church service where people are trying to base their beliefs and practices on the Bible, almost 1/3 of the married people there have been married before and divorced. So if a pastor or a minister were to say that remarriage is an act of adultery, I just don't think that pastor would be at that church much longer. People would be very upset. They're going to feel judged. Such a view would surely have to be wrong. I mean, were we adulterating when we loved our new spouses and everything felt so right? I mean, who are you to say this? I mean, why didn't our pastors warn us? Why isn't anyone else saying this? Why are there so few? So people are going to want to resolve the cognitive dissonance, or maybe they'll just wait 6 months down the road and they'll get it resolved. But one way to do this is to dismiss the person saying that remarriage is adultery, and because they'd have to be wrong, because if they're right, then I've sinned, and I just don't want to believe that. So it's a very personal topic. It's a very sensitive topic. All we can do is talk about these biblical passages, what they mean, dispel some interpretive myths along the way, and leave it to people to apply in their lives as they and their church communities choose. So the scriptures teach that remarriage is an act of adultery. And so naturally, for people who've remarried, the question becomes whether they should dissolve that marriage and go back to the former spouse, or whether they should stay in that marriage in the remarriage. And so here, there's a little bit of a difference in our positions. It's important for the remarried to recognize the adultery involved in the remarriage, but after confessing that sin, what is to be done about the remarriage? And here the opinions differ. So you remember in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 in the Torah had said that a woman who married another man was not permitted to go back to her former spouse. It would be an abomination. So the return to the original spouse was not an option. But also keep in mind that divorce and remarriage were common in Jesus and Paul's day. And I think it's interesting that neither Jesus nor Paul asked those who'd been remarried, even despite how common it was, to leave their spouses behind and return to their former ones. Even in the first 300 years of Christianity, you just don't see a requirement that the remarried people divorce and return to their original spouses. And I think that absence is conspicuous, but I think it also likely reflects the influence of Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. And so while shaming the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, Jesus still recognizes, yes, she's had these 5 husbands, although the man she's currently with wasn't one of the husbands. So a modern pastor would want to urge the remarried to repent of the sin. It's a rather serious sin. And then to draw on the language of 1 Corinthians 7, although not for this particular instance, to stay as you are and to honor God where you find yourself. And certainly the church shouldn't be in the business of marrying divorced people. You get out of that business right away.
Yeah. And so, while there's a disagreement here, I think it's what's more important is that we agree on as we do on remarriage is adultery, and the church can't be remarrying people. When it comes to how you apply that to remarried people, well, that's where we can have some disagreements, and that's where you leave it up to your pastors, and you leave it up to, so long as they are godly men who have the correct position on this. With me, I understand that in terms of honoring your second marriage, it's more so for me about honoring your children. So, and often if you're remarried, you do tend to have kids if your second spouse, and I'd say you have to honor your kids, and they need to have a mom and dad at home, and so that's what you honor. But I think that because Paul said that sex is a concession and not a command, I think that since we know it's adultery, that concession's been taken away. But we'll probably move on. This is going to come up again as we get through some of these questions. To quickly answer this question, this guy said, well, this woman, she's married another man. Turns out the other guy was still alive. Well, I would say she has to leave the second husband and get back with the first one. Andrew, I imagine.
Yeah, and I'd say stay as you are.
Stay as you are. Yeah. This is probably going to happen. A lot of these questions.
Probably, yeah.
But that's okay. I mean, yeah, this is where I did do a 3.5 hour long video. I've linked that description as well with some other Anglican pastors who disagreed on this. One had my view, and of the other 2 didn't. And so, if you're really interested in this, maybe check that video out as well. Okay. We got a question here. A little friendly fire, brothers. If Jesus avoids speaking of the exception altogether in Mark and Luke, why then the emphasis on the permission of divorce for adultery?
Yeah. I mean, again, we're talking you have to understand these are different audiences. And so when Mark is writing to a Gentile audience, Luke to a Gentile audience, in a Jewish audience, you have the statement in the Mishnah that if a spouse is adulterated, you're adulterating to stay with them. And so from a Jewish standpoint, from a Jewish environment, this is a keen concern. Joseph's own morality is at stake with how he handles Mary. And so he's thinking about putting her away. And so what Matthew's doing is giving a permission for these audiences that, yes, the husbands may divorce a wife if they've already adulterated. But again, and at the same time, it's a little different from the surrounding culture in this way too, where it's not a requirement. And so I think it's significant that when you look for quotations of Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And you remember Hosea's situation with this kind of a woman with some loose morals there. It's Matthew's quoting that in Matthew chapter 9 and Matthew chapter 12. And so and yet I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So you don't have Jesus does not convey a requirement that you divorce the wife, but there's a permission here, and mercy can prevail in this situation too.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay, now another question. Let's suppose a Muslim woman, she has an abusive husband, she converts to Christianity, gets baptized, escapes from her home. Could she marry a Christian man? For me, no, she's still married to her Muslim husband.
Right.
And it looks like Andrew's affirming that. This is again an area we would disagree with the Roman Catholic Church. I think the Roman Catholic Church might say she could. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, as we've looked at in 1 Corinthians 7, it says that even if your spouse is unbelieving, you can't divorce them because they're made holy by you. So there's no sense in which only Christians have a valid marriage, or anything like that. Even if it's two unbelievers or a believer and unbeliever, it's still a marriage. And so the rules still apply.
I
And
mean, the
remember, Jesus,
Christian,
when he's
yeah,
teaching, he's talking to Jews, not Christians.
and
So
the Christian has no leverage in First Corinthians to divorce a non-Christian. The Christian
mhm.
is to stay married. It's when the non-Christian is going to force it upon the Christian. So if you're talking about a Muslim person who would like to maintain that marriage, then who are you to force a divorce upon that person?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Another one, because 2 Corinthians 5:17 says that baptism washes away your sins. Does it mean that after you're baptized, your former divorce is sort of gone away? I'd say no. Jesus, when he's teaching, is talking to people who are not Christians, and so his teaching would all of a sudden be essentially pointless if they're all going to get baptized after hearing him anyway, and now everything he just said doesn't matter anymore. So, well, I mean, obviously that means you can't divorce after the fact or whatever, but it just no, they're still alive. So they're still married to that
Yeah, I
person.
mean, you'll get this argument also in Matthew chapter 5, where people will talk about how, what about all Jesus' emphasis on mercy all throughout Matthew's gospel?
Hmm.
And the response is that, yes, I mean, there's mercy, but mercy and forgiveness is not sanctioned for sin.
Mm, yeah. And yeah, and as I said before, it is odd that we hear these arguments. These are the same arguments that conservatives often get from people who affirm homosexuality, and then they often say, "Oh, these are emotional arguments, whatever." But then I hear conservatives make the same arguments to me about divorce and remarriage. Would you guys consider forced marriages to be automatically null and invalid? It would depend on how forced they are. If they're an arranged marriage, the guy said like marriages for convenience or something, then no, it's still a valid marriage. If you're forced, like you know, you're gonna die if you don't make this vow or something, then maybe a case could be made to annul it. But I'm pretty tight on the annulment thing. I think that annulment should be granted very, 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 very rarely. I would be shocked if I ever meet someone who I think uh, would need an annulment to their marriage. It's not something that I would expect to basically ever see in my lifetime. So it shouldn't be. Yeah, I don't know
I
what
want an
you say.
annulment for my shotgun wedding.
Yeah, shotgun wedding,
I
Vegas,
married
you
her
have a
under
crazy
duress.
night. It's still a marriage, and because the
Oh,
vow is
no.
it's still a solemn oath.
So he's my
And we
father-in-law. He
see
wins.
in yeah, but we see in scripture that Isaac, when he blesses Jacob, when he discovers that he blessed the wrong person, he can't take his blessing back. And we see that when Joshua made a vow to save the Gibeonites, and he realized that they totally deceived him, he still has to be faithful to that vow. And it's important to know he's to be faithful to that vow, even though that vow is actually in opposition to God's commandment. God said to kill them. He vowed he wouldn't. And now he says he has to be faithful to that vow lest he come under God's wrath. So he actually has to essentially disobey God's first commandment in order to be faithful to his vow, which is more important. So if you make a vow, even if you made it because you were drunk on a crazy night in Vegas or something, no, it's still a solemn oath. So that's why in the New Testament there's a very clear teaching that solemn oaths should basically almost never be made. I mean, James and Jesus seem to say never. The reformers did discuss that. Calvin discusses that in length in the Institutes. Well, okay, sometimes you can make a vow, but because James says you shouldn't make a vow because otherwise you'll fall under condemnation if you break it. So vows are very serious things. That's why in the Ten Commandments it says, "Do not take the Lord's name in vain." And that's referring to vows. And so, yeah, you make that vow. It's a solemn oath and it's binding. And the only way you're going to get out of it is under some really extreme situations. And it's not something that you'd really expect to see. Certainly not as often as the Roman Catholic Church grants them, which is, yeah. Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Andrew? Or we'll just keep
I'll
going
leave it
through.
there. It's safer that way.
Someone says, what would be the universal conditions to have a marriage? Like binding on all cultures, like what is a marriage? For me, it is vows with sexual consummation. Vows are found in Ezekiel 16:8, and sexual consummation, of course. A man will leave his father and mother, cling to his wife, they'll become one flesh. This is obviously implicitly referring to sex. So the sexual consummation acts in some mysterious way to mystically fuse the two so that they're one flesh. The vow makes that a permanent and binding thing. So that you need both in order for it to be a marriage. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Well, yeah, and it's what's recognized by the surrounding world as a marriage. So there's that social component too as well.
Yeah.
Social recognition. So for a Jewish audience, I mean, the betrothal, you're not consummated yet, but that's the first stage in the marriage. And so you do need a divorce here in this situation for Joseph with Mary.
Yeah.
But it needs to be consummated. So, but that's how that culture is defining it there. So you have these definitions depending on where you are. So if people call it a marriage, it's a marriage.
Sure. Well, we've got a bunch of questions by the same guy, but there's one question from someone else which I want to get to, and maybe we'll look at the other ones and see if there's anything worth answering. But a lot of them are sort of a bit bizarre, like comas and that sort of thing. Well, someone says, I've lost it. Where is it? If someone is a virgin, marries a divorced person, then repents of that, because it says whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, repents of that, leaves that relationship, are they allowed to remarry since their first one was illegitimate? This is a very important question. This is a pastoral sort of application question I think does have some relevance. I have to say, from my perspective, I'm a little bit unsure about that myself. I think what this hinges on is the second marriage, even if it's adultery, is it a legitimate marriage? I am actually leaning towards believing it's not legitimate, because Jesus says the two will be one flesh. Only that marriage is a legitimate, valid marriage. The others are not. And so they can actually remarry or marry for the first time, because that other marriage wasn't really legitimate. But I'm also aware that many great guys who've looked at this issue, I might be wrong, but I think Andrew's included in this. John Piper, Borkham, many other people actually will say, no, even if it's adultery, the second marriage is a legitimate marriage. And if that's true, then I would have to probably say that if someone married a divorced person and then repented, maybe they can't marry after that. But I don't know, Andrew, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you've married a divorced person, the first marriage, I would again say stay where you are. Recognize the sin, repent of it, but don't make it worse. And then certainly marry someone else.
What if they do, though, Andrew? So what if let's say I'm a single guy. I'm obviously not, but I'm a single guy. I marry a divorced woman, and then let's just say she divorces me. Yeah, maybe she divorces people often. Can I remarry now?
No.
Okay, because that was a legitimate marriage.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I probably would just default to that then, because Andrew can now add to the list of yet another person who has that position. I just was still a little bit unsure about it. We've gone over time, Andrew. I don't know if you can stay for a few more minutes. I've just got maybe a final question for you. Yeah. The question would be then, where would you point to say that the second marriage, even though it's adulterous, is still a legitimate marriage? Because I think that's really important question.
Exactly. I mean, it's like the woman who had 5 husbands. I mean, it's an awful situation. Jesus is shaming her for it. Mm-hmm. So we're not minimizing in any way the sin involved here, the adultery involved here, the shame involved here. But just we've made a mess.
I think that's that.
Stay where you are. Don't make any more. You've done enough. Don't make any more mess.
Yeah. We talked about this in the live discussion I did with Jared and Jack Shannon, and Jared mentions this because he has your position on the Pastoral Application, and he said it's very important that the church, our message is we're pro-marriage, we're against divorce, we're not into splitting things up, and he says it might be counterproductive for the church now be saying, all you guys need a divorce, or you guys need to separate, and that's actually giving exactly the wrong message. I really do appreciate the force and weight of that argument. That's a powerful argument to make. But I'm just, for me, it's just, if Jesus says it's adultery, I can't really reconcile how it continues to be adultery. So would you say it's like an adultery? It's an initial act of adultery to get that remarriage, and then essentially it's no longer adultery?
It depends on how you evaluate Carol Osborne's article on divorce and adultery. And I tend to agree with them that this notion of continuous action in adulterating, is there a notion of continuous actions continuing, or is it focused simply on the action itself? And really, Osborne's his point is just that it really depends on the context. And he makes the case here across Matthew that the vast majority, I think it's something like 90%, over 90% of the verbs in Matthew's gospel, the present tense really doesn't have that continuous sense. It's a focus really on the action involved. And so then the question is, we do have some places where there's a continuing action, but most places it's not the case. And then the question is, well, what's going on here? Let's say in Matthew chapter 19. And then the question is, well, what are the instances that involve adultery? What are these instances? So we're not really talking about whether it's continuing or not. We're really talking about what they are in the first place. And so I find that argument persuasive. I don't find an emphasis in the context on a continuing action there that I would need to argue from the verb that way. And I think it overloads the verb to talk about as continuing to adulterate. Certainly adultery has taken place and serious, but and certainly until it's addressed with repentance, you're in a situation of adultery.
Sure. Yeah.
It continues, I guess, in that sense. Until you repent, you're an adulteress or an adulterer.
Well, for people listening, we definitely would want to emphasize though that you still shouldn't get remarried. Okay, so I can imagine there might be someone thinking, well, if Andrew's right, then maybe I can get remarried. It's adultery at first, but God will forgive me after, and that is exactly the wrong.
It's kind of like maybe I just go murder somebody because that's God
will forgive me after. Yeah, it's terrible.
I mean, why would you do this? Because there's sins that just darken your soul, and you're not the same person you were before the sin. So there's a tremendous cost entailed in these kinds of sins, and people who've gone through divorce or marriage, they know how serious this is. It's not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a little bit similar to how I think the Bible is clear that Christians should not be marrying non-Christians. Paul says that a widow can remarry, but only in the Lord. And of course, the Old Testament is clear that Jews aren't to marry Gentiles, and we Christians, we would apply that to non-Christians. But then Paul says that if you are married to an unbeliever, you can't divorce them. So if a Christian does marry a non-Christian, which I think the scriptures are clear you shouldn't be doing, Paul says what has light to do with darkness and that sort of thing. Well, now you stay with them. But it's and someone might say, well, okay, fine. Well, maybe I'm not supposed to marry this unbelieving woman, but I'm really attracted to her and I want to, and God will forgive me after. Well, yeah, but there's going to be problems for the rest of your life, probably. If she or he doesn't convert, you'll find that being married to an unbeliever is going to lead to some serious problems. And I think it will be the same thing for people who get remarried after a divorce. It's not going to be an easy life. And of course, as we talked about, Paul says that celibacy is superior to marriage anyway.
But even more, I mean, this is not the thinking of a Christian. So when you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when adultery, these are what you formerly were. It's not what you are now. And so we're different people than we were before we were in Christ. So to even think in these terms is to think as a non-Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, we'll do one last question then. How do we see the case law in Deuteronomy 24 verses 1-3? Can it be used as an evidence of divorce annulling the covenant? I'll just say Andrew's book is looking at the New Testament, and it's looking at what Christians, the early church, believe. So Deuteronomy 24 does come up, of course, in your book, Andrew, but yeah, it's not a focus.
It's briefer. Yeah, very brief treatment.
Yeah. How I would respond to this is I'd point out that in Deuteronomy 24, it says that the reason why the man can't take his wife back is because she's been defiled. The question is, how has she been defiled? When was she defiled? And I believe that if we sort of cross-reference that word defiled and where it comes up, I think it's clear that the defilement was adultery. But no such adultery has taken place when he divorced her. He just says that he divorces her for some indecency in her. I think the implicit teaching here is that she's been defiled by the remarriage, and so and that would make sense, right? Because God's law is fixed in place; He doesn't change. So if God has said that the two shall be one flesh, and what God has brought together, let not man separate, and Jesus says that's how it was in the beginning, then yes, even during the time of Moses, if someone remarried, it was still adultery at that time. And Jesus says that Moses only permitted, not commanded, permitted divorce because of the hardness of your heart. So it's similar to polygamy, where you do have this thing, people shouldn't be having polygamous relationships, but God did tolerate it to a certain degree because people did not have the regeneration of the Holy Ghost. So their hearts were made of stone. They had not yet been healed, as we see in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. And so God did have to tolerate some things and put up with people. That's no longer the case because of the rebirth that is now offered to us in baptism. And so, yeah, I'd say that with Deuteronomy 24, it does implicitly suggest that she's been defiled by the remarriage, and therefore it's not evidence for divorce annulling the marriage. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been defiled by the remarriage. Anything you want to add to that, Andrew, or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, there's one scholar who takes that reading of Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. I think it's, if I recall correctly, it's in the book. I think it's in when you get into the second chapter where I'm talking about Deuteronomy 24. Todd Scasewater, I think, had argued this, that it's actually when the woman's been put away by her husband and she marries again, that then there's the defilement takes place at that point and not later. So yeah, there is that view there. It's a difficult passage. It's controversial. It's also a minority position there, but I tend to agree with it. But then you do have the abomination if she goes back to her former husband. So there are a couple things going on there. It's a complex text that's not clear in the exegetical literature how to fully unpack it all.
Yeah, it does seem to be referring to maybe some sort of semi-common scenario that happened at that time that's probably just been lost to history. It looks like maybe something was going on and we don't entirely know what was happening, but
yeah, whether property issues or other things going on there.
Yeah, people have suggested maybe there's some sort of almost like financial fraud going on with dowries and
that's possible,
that kind of thing. But yeah, we can't really know. Yeah, okay, well that's the Q&A. There are other questions too, but I think that us talking about the pastoral stuff is sort of answered all those anyway. So we'll just reiterate that if you do seek pastoral guidance on this, then you need to go to a pastor. But yeah, preferably a pastor who does have the right view on this, because obviously if they're going to think that you can't remarry anyway, they're probably not going to give you the right advice.
Yeah, start with the scriptures, then go to the pastor.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, well, unless you have anything to add, Andrew, this has been a really great interview. Thank you so much for all your wisdom and the time you've put into this and your study and everything. You've done great. You've really helped, I think, solidify this case and look at how the counter arguments don't really hold up when they're put under scrutiny. And I want to reaffirm to everyone, if you're interested in this topic, definitely buy this book, Andrew's new book. Again, linked in the description. Remarriage in Early Christianity. It's great, good scholarly work. And I think if you're unsure about it, then you definitely give that a read. Also, check out the sermon that's down there, the article I wrote, and the other live stream I did about the Pastoral Application if you have more questions about that. Otherwise, Andrew, thank you so much. And it was great to see you. God bless you.
And you, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, to all you viewers, God bless you all. And yeah, be faithful to the scriptures, obey Jesus' commandments, live a chaste, godly life, but obviously also remember that we're saved through faith in him alone. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. God bless.